yeah, and so Descartes was carrying the flag for philosophy and ethics, and I've gone into detail on his teachings about that. It's very interesting. And then I've also talked about Lord Bacon, Francis Bacon. He said more about ethics than people realise. People think he was just a scientist, and they don't really like his character. They think he was corrupt and all that. I think that's a mistake. I think he was a very wise man, and I think he was suffering from a lot of character assassination. And books have come out that have, revealed that. And in fact, embedded in his work, The Advancement of Learning and other treatises, are some very profound ethical points, which I've been exploring. And then I've come to Leibniz and Spinoza. Now, Spinoza is, he was one of the first people to write a huge long treatise called The Ethics, which I've again gone into in detail for my book. And Spinoza really inspired me to become a philosopher. I think he was an amazing chap who was, his commitment to philosophy, it wasn't a sort of job, it was a calling, and he wanted to find ultimate truth now, and that includes ultimate truth in ethics, and he thought he could do that geometrically, like with as much certainty as Euclid. I think he failed in his book, The Ethics, and I explain, I think, why. But it was a pretty good attempt. For his pains, he was kicked out of the Jewish synagogue in Amsterdam where he lived, and was called a heretic. So he was a heretic Jew. He was called a heretic by lots of Christians who, didn't like him because he was, I don't know, too intellectual for them probably. So he ended up being like a thrice heretic. One of his heresies was that he said that God is not just the absent creator who's now, in some vast pan-galactic distances away. No, God is actually infused here in all time and all space and all mind and all consciousness and all will and all bodies and in our lives. And so this was dismissed as pantheism, and he was castigated as a heretic for that reason as well. But any philosopher that's kind of worth their salt, I think, has got to have a bit of pantheism in them, a bit of nature worship. And so Spinoza did. He falls down on his lack of understanding of the female element of human beings. He had a typical patriarchal view in his lifetime. Women didn't have the vote. They weren't allowed to own property. They were literally the property of their husbands. And their intellectual capacities were underestimated. They were not educated. And Spinoza didn't question those prejudices of his time. It's what Bacon would have called the idols of the tribe. And so he fails on that point, in my view, ethically. But it was a good attempt at sort of a scientific overview of ethics. So then. And one commentator or critique has come up with the theory that Spinoza was secretly gay, and that's kind of partly his prejudice against women. And somebody's written a novel exposing that that Spinoza had this love affair, sort of intellectual, physical love affair with a bloke, and that's the big secret of Spinoza. Well, Holland is pretty liberal now, and that wouldn't be such a big thing. In those days, it was a criminal thing. You couldn't come out as homosexual. So that's why he had to keep it all quiet. That's interesting. The secret lives of philosophers are interesting. And Spinoza's one example. So is Descartes, who actually did have a love affair with a Dutch woman. And they actually had a daughter together. This has also just come out and been made into a novel. And I'm planning to do a conference on Descartes. It'll have to be on Zoom, probably. I'd love to go on pilgrimage after to the place where he was born. Okay, and then I'm looking at Leibniz, who is another of those great names of European philosophy that I studied at university years ago. But we're never taught the really interesting things about these guys, I think philosophy teaching could be so much better than it is. Leibniz was an amazing character, and he was He had a foot in both Protestant and Catholic camps. He was brought up a Protestant. His parents were both attached to the University of Leipzig in Germany. And his mother was the daughter of a professor there, and his father was an actual professor there. He was a prodigy. He was reading like Latin, Greek, and loads of languages in his father's library by the age of 12 or something. And he was a polymath and a trans-dimensional cosmic thinker, really, Leibniz. He studied mathematics. He was one of the inventors, co-inventors with Newton of calculus. But he was also very interested in comparative religion. And the sources I've been looking at show that he went to meet Spinoza, by the way. He was very interested in esoteric Judaism. He was a friend of Francis Mercurius van Helmont, the son of a famous scientist, who was a deep, deep Kabbalist, Christian Kabbalist, who had studied the Zohar and all the kind of esoteric Jewish writings. And Leibniz knew him personally, and they lapped it up together. He was deeply into the esoteric origins of consciousness and matter. His theory of the monad was a kind of Jain view, that everything is made of particles of consciousness, effectively. Everything, like every star, galaxy, photon, everything is made of particles of consciousness, which he called monads. It's as good a theory as any, if you can beat that one, think of something else, that's great. But I mean, quantum physics is sort of coming round to that view. Leibniz was also in touch with Chinese philosophers who, through a famous Jesuit, Bouvet, who was sent by the King of France to go to China and study Chinese philosophy and take Christian philosophy and do a sort of exchange, like cultural diplomacy, which I think is such a good idea. I believe in cultural diplomacy. Much better than bombing. This is where the American foreign policy of the last few decades has left a lot to be desired, I think, in my view. And the British. Instead of bombing countries, we should do cultural diplomacy. Louis XIV had the right idea, so that's why he sent Bouvet, the great Jesuit, to the court of Beijing, where he met the emperor, and they got on very well. And in fact, the emperor gave him a little bit of Beijing to build a church and set up an academy and stuff. He brought with him lots of scientific instruments, and he was able to discuss with Chinese science. Oh, and he learned Chinese, right? These Jesuits were serious scholars. So they were able to discuss with the Chinese philosophers the ins and outs of their cosmology. And among many other things, they studied the classics, and they brought the I Ching back to Europe. Bouvet translated the I Ching into Latin, and it ended up on Leibniz's desk. Now, the I Ching, as any Jungian scholar knows, is one of those cosmic books that you just fall in love with, And I've loved the I Ching ever since I discovered it in my, adolescent first beginnings of philosophy. And but Leibniz realized mathematically it was very interesting, and it triggered in him the invention of binary mathematics, which is the basic numbering system that all computers and digital information technology depends on. So dear old Leibniz invented the modern computer age, mathematically. That was just one of the things he did, right? So he was also a peace thinker, and he advised his friend Sophia Charlotte in Berlin, who was married to the King of Prussia, to found the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, which is still going to this day. So Leibniz also believed in institution building, like me, setting up a peace institute and so on. I recognize a kindred spirit in Leibniz. He wasn't just a sort of solitary thinker. He wanted to inspire and engage with groups of people, to do the complicated and difficult task of thinking stuff through together, which is what institutes are for. And that academy in Berlin is still going. So anyway, dear old Leibniz also had a lot to say about ethics, and I've been researching it, and it's all in my book. Which, as I say, I'm working on at the moment actively. So I'm so excited about it. I'm sharing it because if we don't recover some kind of ethics, I think we're doomed as a planet. This is like a race against. It's like one of those cowboy movies where you've got to head them off at the pass. We've got to head off the unethical lot who seem to be trying to take over the planet, who have no sense of proportional limits or morality, who lie as if that's a natural state of things to do, and who are interested only in promoting their private power, their private, wealth, and all the rest of it. So this is where I part company with them. Sorry, I'm having a frog in my throat here. I get so excited talking about Leibniz. Okay, I've also been looking at the existentialist tradition and their contributions to ethics. So I've been working through, the whole history of modern existentialism, Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Sartre and Camus and an amazing Russian-Ukrainian philosopher called Shestov and others, and summing up what I think their contributions are to ethics, which are, again, profound. I mean, Sartre lived through the German occupation here in Paris, and should one fight? Should one join the resistance? I think he believed that there's such a thing as intellectual resistance, and that's equally valuable, and that to go and sort of put dynamite under trains and get blown up might be a waste of an intellectual. I tend to take the same view. But intellectual resistance is incredibly important, and Sartre devoted his whole life to thinking through the nature of reality. And we all know his famous book, Being and Nothingness, which influenced the existentialism of the 50s and 60s. What people don't realise is he always planned like a sequel to deal with ethics, but he never wrote it. He never finished it. He didn't have time. Nothing worked out. He was busy being a novelist and a playwright as well, and a teacher, let alone, in partnership with Simone de Beauvoir, who also needed quite a lot of time. And so he never finished his great work of ethics. And the notebooks have been published. He did also, he wrote some important works, and towards the end of his life, he got very interested in trying to finish off his oeuvre, because he knew that, he was going to come up and die eventually. And he wrote in the final sort of bit of his life a book that was only published posthumously called Truth and Existence. Now this is very interesting because he talks in this book, which was published after his death, about ignoring as the active component of ignorance. Now, I didn't realise before doing the research that this is where Sartre had got to towards the end of his life. He died in 1980, because I've written a book about ignorance as well, and about the fear of wisdom, Sophiophobia, which is the cause of ignorance. I mean, you either love wisdom and knowledge and you become passionate about it, or you kind of fear it, you hate it, you don't like it, you can't control it. And, that's the sort of, the choice we all have to make ethically. So in this, it's only a short book Sartre did right at the end of his life, Truth and Existence. He was talking about the active negativing of knowledge. Right? So, and that can take many forms. That can be, oh, shut up, I don't want to listen to you anymore, kind of response. Or, my God, what you're saying is dangerous. We're going to lock you up and torture you. Response to, my God, you're a heretic. We're going to pull your toenails off and burn you alive. All those are forms of what I call Sophiophobia, right? And all tyrants do that, whether they're Nazis or Stalinists or Maoists, or, sorry to say, sweet American types that want to silence any other discourse that doesn't fit into their worldview. Like, for instance, Iranian Shiism. Everything is permissible in America apparently, apart from being pro-Iranian or pro-Shiism. Okay, so who's doing the ignoring? That's what we have to ask. Or in Israel, why don't we set up an Israeli-Iranian friendship society? I have a dear friend, a German student, who's doing a PhD on Iranian-Israeli peace diplomacy, and she's also giving birth and being a young mother, so the PhD might take a while, but that's an incredibly important study. We need more friendship between Iranian and Hebrew and Israeli culture. because it goes right back to the times when it was Iran that let the Israeli people go back and rebuild Jerusalem. There's no logical or metaphysical or theological reason for Iran and Israeli theologians not to talk to each other about peace. And it's something that my institute has been working for some time. There is a peace museum in Tehran. Most people don't know that. It's one of the few in the Middle East. And as I say, they have a large interfaith community, Christians, Jews, and others. So, and the level of the sophistication of their intellectual life is profound. Mullah Sadra, one of the greatest philosophers of Iranian thought, was from Iran, and the whole school of Shiism and Sufi mysticism is connected, because the Sufis all look back on Ali as their lineage holder, if you want. He was their window to the Prophet. And the Shias also in their lineage of imams, they look back on Ali and the family, the Ahlul Bayt, the house of the Prophet, as they were sacred to them because they loved them. And of course they were sacred, and if you love someone, you love their children and their children's children. So really we need to transform the hate speech. I mean, it's great, Facebook has this thing against hate speech, and I totally agree with it. But we need to end the hate speech going on the planet as a whole, which is, going on all over the place, right? We need to transform that into a love speech, which is why I've created the Love Journal. I try to look at academic studies into love. But loving language, loving words, is, I think, the most supreme form of love that we can have. Yes, you can make love physically, and that's wonderful and beautiful, but if you don't also have an intellectual love, or a moral love, or a heart love, or a mind or a word love, then it's meaningless. It's just like random actions by two bodies. No, what we need is loving words to replace the hate speech on the planet. And for that we need the greatest Sufi theologians, greatest Shia theologians, greatest Israeli theologians, greatest Christian, and all the others, to come together and discuss the nature of love. Now that's what existentialism sort of tried to do, and is trying to do. It's what I've done in my book Being and Knowledge, which is a sort of continuation of Sartre's Being and Nothingness and Heidegger's Being and Time. They're dead and gone. They finished, did their work. It was not finished. Sartre didn't ever finish his last section that was going to be on ethics. Well, I've done it for him in my book Being and Knowledge, inspired by their example and the whole canon of philosophical study. I've done this huge 10-volume work, Being and Knowledge. Only the first 2 volumes have been published. And that's a lot of it is about ethics. Now this book I'm working on, The Ethical Calculus, is a little forerunner of that. It's a shorter book, it's only going to be not that long. But I'm rushing it out now because the world needs it now. We are suffering from a complete collapse of ethics. And in every religion, you see people doing the opposite of what the religion proposes, and hijacking it for nationalism and narrow xenophobic kind of goals. You see this in India, in Britain, with the whole Brexit madness. You see it in America with the sort of Christian right making Jesus out to be some sort of white racist. I mean, it's unbelievable what's being done. And the same in extreme Zionist Israeli circles, where Judaism has been hijacked as a sort of nationalist, excuse to bash Palestinians and Muslims and Christians and anyone else with. I mean, all that's abhorrent, and my book on the ethical calculus, I think, will make clear that the grounds on which, the reasons why that's not appropriate. And it's not an attack on anyone personally. I'm sure that all the Israeli settlers in the West Bank are lovely people at heart, or all the white racist Christians in America are good people somewhere hidden in there. All the Brexit voters, The job is, how do we unleash the language of love within them instead of the language of hate? Now, the language of hate comes from fear. It's all about fear. So the Brexit thing is all about the fear of the other, the fear of the immigrant, the fear of the black, the fear of the oppressed guy coming back and getting me. the fear of, well, God, if we let the Palestinians come into, they might knife us, whatever. It's that fear. Okay, so enter another philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, another kind of existentialist phenomenologist here in France, who said that ethics is the first thing of philosophy. He called it the first philosophy. We have to go back to it. Now, he wrote a number of books about ethics. He never finished a great, huge treatise, but he made, raids into the unspeakable, as Thomas Merton put it. And he produced the theory that ethics begins with the personal encounter. It's you and me meeting. That's ethics. And if we end up fighting and attacking each other, that's a failure. If we end up being friends, chatting, talking, loving each other, expressing words of love, that's a triumph of ethics. It's as simple as that. It's human interaction. So Levinas is another figure who comes into the book. And then there's my friend, the existentialist from who came from Russia, and who ended up living in France, actually, who died in Boulogne, I've discovered, which was very sad. He lived from 1866 to 1938. Lev Shestov, who was born Schwarzman in Kiev. And his critique of philosophy is very interesting. He said he began as a Jewish thinker. He was trained in Moscow and Petersburg and was going to study law. He did. He surveyed the whole of Western and Russian and Slavic and Jewish philosophical literature up to then. And he said, look, the trouble is they're trying to make a science out of it, and life is irrational. You can't just figure it all out logically. Life is a passion. It's a thing lived, with gusto, for good and evil. And it comes from the human heart. And so he read Kierkegaard, he read the existentialist literature, he read Dostoevsky, who was making the same point, that people are not rational. There's an irrational streak in us that does the weird thing. I may, as Paul said, know what is the right thing to do, and then I go and do the opposite. That's what human beings are. We're weird, right? And so Shestov said, well, we have to study that weirdness in its totality. You can't pretend it's not happening, brush it under the carpet. I mean, why did Hitler do what he did? Why did he think it was a cool idea to kill millions of Jews just for being Jewish? What was so bonkers about him? And the fact is that he was partly Jewish. This was all a form of psychological unconscious self-hatred. Some people argue, psychohistorians, and there's some truth to that. The worst kind of hatred is self-hatred. It's when you hate yourself, you kind of want to commit suicide. So what Hitler was doing was sort of mass collective self-hatred. Well, how can we replace that with the language of love? That's what Shestov was trying to do, and it's what I'm trying to do. He was friends with Berdyaev, the great Christian existentialist thinker, who also took refuge in France. France is a homeland to a lot of thinkers over the centuries, as I've been discovering. And anyway, he wrote some amazing books, and I recommend you to look at them. And I've summarized and put into my my book on ethics, some of his insights. And then he died in 1938 in Boulogne, in France, just before the Holocaust, before World War II started. He would have been appalled, absolutely appalled at the horrors. But it would have sort of confirmed his worst fears. He was saying people are capable of sheer bestiality, and any kind of ethics has to explain that. And he said the problem was partly because of the smug kind of scientistic intellectuals that go around saying, well, we know, we proved it all. It's logical positivist types, or Marxists who think they have a theory that can explain everything, and if you question it, you're bad and evil. Their view of ethics is it's whatever the party says at this time. So if Stalin says all the kulaks are to be imprisoned, well, that's ethical. That's what the party says, so that's right. No, that's kind of what kids do in the very, very beginning lesson of ethics. You learn that's not ethics. So Shestov sort of pointed out the flaws and where they came from, which was Marx's naive and adolescent determination
to turn philosophy into something scientific. I mean, it was a folie de grandeur, as the French say. It's not possible to turn the complexities of life into something purely and totally scientific, because science is not sophisticated enough. I mean, I defy any scientist out there, sitting out there watching this video, and don't forget, I love science. I've taught history of science and medicine. I'm a lover of science, but that means I know its limitations, like Shestov did. So, for instance, okay, I defy you to tell me how many particles of energy there are in me as I'm giving this talk. Just count them. I just want a number, right? Just a specific, concrete, a guesstimate will do, obviously. And, yeah, at any one moment, right? Because they're popping in and out of existence all the time. So that's sort of a tricky bit I've added on there. And the fact is, the number is incalculable, actually. And the fact is that, if you add all the Higgs bosons and all the subdivisions of all the microparticles that CERN keep discovering, add them all in, factor them all in, well, it's an incalculably vast number. And then the fact is that they seem to be popping in and out of the void and obeying weird laws to do with dark energy that maths hasn't quite got its head round. So that number is indefinable and incalculable. Well, therefore, you see, science cannot tell me. Well, I can tell you, because it's ultimately it's the Atman speaking. It's the coherent, integrated self that Jung talked about. It's the consciousness of spirit that is speaking, which is beyond number. Now, that was Shestov's point. The thing about the human being is our spiritual nature, which is incalculable, and as yet is beyond science. But it's what philosophy deals with, and it's what ethics has to deal with, because it's because of that experience of my subjectivity that I have a soul, to use Christian language. It means I'm not going to persecute you or torture you or kill you for some sort of pseudo-scientific theory I've cooked up that tells me, I should go and massacre you because you're a kulak or you're a whatever. So anyway, that's kind of what I've been doing. That's my work on bringing French and existential thought into the study of ethics. It's going very well, and fascinating stuff. Now I want to mention another thing I've been working on this week, which is another book I'm writing. I don't seem to take on small projects, you might have noticed. I'm working on... okay, I've said this before, but in case you've not listened, this is a sequel to Newton's Principia Mathematica. Now, Newton, bless him, who's one of my intellectual heroes, I love Newton. I've been to his house, Woolsthorpe Manor, commune with his spirit. In the very end of Principia Mathematica, he has a wonderful passage. He says, look, guys, I've explained what gravity is. I've told you everything about gravity, how it works, the maths. But what I haven't actually explained is what it is. I've done the maths, but I can't explain what it is or how it's caused. And I do think that's probably got something to do with the fact that it's something to do with God, the divine intelligence behind the universe, who I think is suffused throughout all time and all space. Now that's where the book ends, right? Now that's where my book begins, because I'm saying it's time we finish that unfinished volume of Newton and look at what a religious mathematics might look like. How can we even begin to start doing equations about the God factor behind gravity or consciousness and energy and mass? If we change Einstein's equation equals mc squared and add consciousness in, where do we put it? How do we even begin to quantify consciousness? Well, can we? So that's what the book's about, right? And it's to appeal to both mathematicians and also religious studies experts and philosophers and consciousness studies people and people interested in comparative mysticism and so on. So that's a great book. I'm really enjoying doing that. That's a real romp for me. And yeah, so that's what I'm doing there. And again, it should be finished, I don't know, within a little while. It's going to take a few months, that one. And so, for instance, I've just finished the work on what is zero, and I've looked at, what zero is mathematically, and also in religion. And it's very interesting because zero pops up in both. And, you know, what zero is sometimes a great terrifying void. And other times it's enlightenment. Buddha thought zero was pretty cool. It's where you go for enlightenment. And I've got a couple of great quotes on zero. Let me just share. So there's a Chinese sage was asked the following, and this is in the section on zero. What is the mind of void and calm, numinous awareness? The sage, Chinul, replied, what has just asked me this question is precisely your mind of void and calm, numinous awareness. Why not trace back its radiance rather than search for it outside? That's a lovely quote from a very famous Buddhist thinker. And then there's a quote from Shestov, my existentialist from Russia and France, who said, there is no need to renounce the gifts of the earth, but we must not forget heaven for their sakes. However much we may have attained in science, yet we must remember that science can give us no truth, because by its very nature it will not and cannot seek for the truth. The truth lies there where science sees the nothing, in that single, uncontrollable, incomprehensible thing, which is always at war with explanation, the fortuitous. So those are just two different ways of looking at zero. And the book gives lots of mathematical puzzles. It's a sort of how-to book. It would be of interest to people that are good at maths, that can work this out, sort of. You know, but also religious studies people. So it's an interdisciplinary study, partly maths, partly religious studies. And I've been working on this on and off during my teaching career. As a RE teacher, I would often stray into the maths department or have interesting conversations with the head of maths in the staff room and so on. And some of my students would be doing maths A-level or whatever, and we get into interesting discussions. So there is a whole interesting field that I'm exploring here. And I want to just share one little quote I've come up with from Plato, which is in the book. Plato being one of my heroes. I love this quote. It's from the Republic, which should be required reading by all politicians. You shouldn't be allowed to be an MP unless you've read the Republic, in my view. And it would then teach them a bit of humility, which is what they're lacking. You know, the Boris Johnson lot. Shocking arrogance. Shocking arrogance. Every single Brexit MP has showed unbelievable, shocking arrogance. They then fake humility. Actors, you know, they use their arrogance to seize power, and then they pretend to be humble. I mean, it is such a masquerade. Shakespeare would be, you know, he's probably writing the plays now. Anyway, so this quote is very interesting. Can I find it? Well, basically, I mean, there are different translations, but essentially what he says in the Republic here is that he's never met a mathematician that can reason. What he means by that, and sort of explains it, is that the mathematician, and it's in the mouth of Socrates, or